Sometimes, life has a funny way of giving you the perfect chance to watch someone reap exactly what they sowed. I didn't plan it. I didn't plot it. But when the moment came, I can't deny how satisfying it felt. Back in 1997, I was just looking for a summer job. My stepdad was the operations manager at a company that specialized in telecommunications work. Laying cable, building out infrastructure, all the stuff most people never think about but rely on every day. He offered to hire me for a few months so I could earn some money before going back to school. At first, I thought it would be temporary, just a paycheck to hold me over. But by the end of the summer, I realized I actually liked the work. I liked the problem solving, the pace, the sense of building something real. So I decided to stay on. I didn't think much about the politics of the place. Sure, it wasn't the most professional company. Paychecks were sometimes late, and there was always gossip about whether the owner was skimming money off the top. But I was young, I liked my team, and I figured every workplace had its issues. I had no idea how quickly things would fall apart, or how the decisions made back then would come full circle many years later. It didn't take long for me to see that my stepdad and the owner were on a collision course. My stepdad was a practical guy. He believed in getting the work done right, paying people what you promised, and not playing games. The owner, well, let's just say he had a different philosophy. He was the kind of boss who would argue over pennies on an invoice while spending thousands on impressing clients he barely liked. He liked to act like every success was his doing, and every problem was someone else's fault. The tension between them was like a slow burn. At first, it was little disagreements, whose responsibility it was to follow up on certain contracts, how much overtime was really necessary, whether paying for better tools was worth it. Nothing explosive, just friction. But it kept building. I tried to stay out of it. After all, I was just a young tech, working long hours and trying to learn the ropes. I thought maybe if I kept my head down and did my job, none of it would affect me. But then came the day the friction finally sparked into open conflict. It was over something ridiculously minor, a shipment of supplies that was delayed, pushing a project behind schedule by a few days. My stepdad wanted to bring in an extra crew to catch up and keep the client happy. The owner refused, saying it wasn't worth the expense. They argued in the office for nearly an hour, voices rising until everyone could hear them. And when my stepdad finally walked out, red-faced and silent, we all knew something had snapped. The next morning, he was gone. Just like that, fired over what amounted to a difference in priorities. I remember feeling stunned. He'd given years to that company. He'd built teams, trained people, fixed problems nobody else wanted to touch. And now he was out the door because the owner didn't want to admit he might be wrong. I should have taken it as a sign to leave too. But I stayed. Partly because I needed the job, partly because I was stubborn, and partly because I didn't want to feel like I was quitting just because things got uncomfortable. Unfortunately, it didn't get better. After my stepdad left, a lot of the professionalism he'd tried to instill vanished. Payroll got sloppier. Promises about raises and benefits turned into vague excuses. I started noticing that the owner only seemed interested in keeping employees happy if it was convenient for him. And more often, it wasn't. I put up with it for another 18 months, thinking maybe things would improve. They didn't. So when the opportunity came to jump ship to a major telecommunications provider we'd done subcontract work for, I took it without hesitation. And as it turned out, that choice would eventually put me in a position to write the final chapter of this story in a way I never could have imagined. Leaving that company felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown. At first, I was worried I'd made a mistake, starting over somewhere bigger, more corporate, where I'd just be another face in a sea of employees. But almost immediately, it was clear I'd traded up. At the new telecommunications provider, everything was different. People got paid on time. Contracts were clear. If you earned something, you got it, no endless runaround or half-baked promises. Most importantly, they treated employees like professionals instead of disposable labor. Over time, I climbed the ladder. I learned how to manage crews, run budgets, oversee large-scale projects. It felt good to see my work respected and my skills valued. A few years in, I moved into a role that came with more responsibility than I'd ever expected. I became the person who hired and managed the contractors who did construction projects for our company. It was the exact kind of work my old employer specialized in. I knew there was always a chance our paths might cross again, but I didn't think much about it. I was too busy learning to juggle budgets that ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars and managing timelines that spanned months. And then one morning, I got an email that made me sit back in my chair. The sender's name was immediately familiar. The owner of the very company that had fired my stepdad and treated me like I was expendable. He wanted to set up a meeting. He explained in polite, professional language that his company was hoping to get on our approved contractor list. He described the potential fit, mentioned their experience, and suggested we meet over lunch to discuss it. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I remembered the way he used to breeze around the office, acting like everyone owed him gratitude for a paycheck that barely showed up on time. I remembered the way he'd fired my stepdad over something trivial and never looked back. I thought about the paychecks I'd had to chase down, the benefits I never received, the condescension I'd endured as a young employee. And now, here he was, hat in hand, hoping I'd throw him a lucrative contract. I could feel a slow, satisfied smile spreading across my face. I knew in that moment exactly how this was going to go. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't gloat. I wouldn't even mention the past, at least not right away. I'd accept the lunch invitation. I'd let him give me his polished pitch. And then, when the time was right, I'd remind him exactly who I was, and who he'd tossed aside all those years ago. I didn't rush to reply to his email. I let it sit in my inbox for a day, maybe two. Partly because I wanted him to wonder if he'd hear back, and partly because I wanted to savor the irony of it all. When I finally wrote back, I kept it polite and professional. Thank you for reaching out. I'd be glad to meet and hear more about your company's capabilities. Let's set up a lunch meeting. I picked a restaurant I'd always wanted to try. A place I probably wouldn't have splurged on if I were paying out of pocket. If I was going to listen to this guy pitch, I might as well enjoy some good food. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early and got a table near the windows. I sat there nursing a glass of iced tea, watching him walk in. He looked exactly the same. Same confident stride, same forced grin that never quite reached his eyes. If he recognized me right away, he didn't show it. He shook my hand, introduced himself, and launched into his polished speech about his company's track record. How they were the best in the business. How they valued their employees. How they believed in doing right by their clients. I listened, nodding occasionally, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smirking, because I knew the truth behind all that corporate fluff. I'd seen firsthand how little he valued the people who worked for him, especially when it stopped being convenient. Halfway through his pitch, he paused to drop the names of other companies he'd worked with, big ones, reputable ones, hoping to impress me. I just kept my expression neutral. I waited until the plates were cleared and the coffee arrived before I finally spoke up. You know, I said casually, I actually used to work for your company. He blinked. Oh, really? He was still smiling, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Yes, I continued. Back in the late 90s, I was hired by the operations manager. You might remember him. He was my stepdad. That was the moment. I watched recognition dawn across his face, followed by a quick, unmistakable flash of panic. He remembered, and he knew exactly what he'd done back then. For a few seconds, he didn't say a word. He just sat there with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, eyes darting back and forth like he was searching for the right response. I didn't rush him. I let the silence stretch out, let him stew in that moment of dawning realization. He cleared his throat and tried to recover, offering a thin smile. Oh well, that was a long time ago, he said carefully. I'm sure. Things were very different back then. I raised an eyebrow. Sure, I said evenly. They were. He shifted in his seat. I could see the gears turning in his head, trying to calculate how much I remembered, how much I cared. The truth was, I didn't need an apology. I wasn't looking for revenge in the dramatic sense, but I wasn't about to pretend the past didn't exist, especially not when he was sitting across from me, hoping I'd hand over contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He started to ramble about how much the company had grown, how they'd learned a lot since then, how they valued integrity and fairness more than ever. It was almost impressive the way he tried to spin it. Like if he threw enough polished words at me, I'd forget the look on my stepdad's face the day he was fired over something petty. I let him finish. Then I set my napkin down and folded my hands on the table. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet," I said calmly. "And I appreciate the lunch." He looked relieved, clearly thinking he was in the clear. "But," I continued, "I have to be honest. My list of approved contractors is already full. And the companies on it have proven they can meet our standards, both in the quality of their work and the way they treat their employees." The relief vanished from his face like someone had flipped a switch. He opened his mouth. Maybe to argue, maybe to plead, but I held up a hand. "I'll keep your information on file," I said, polite but final. "If something changes, I'll let you know." He knew exactly what that meant. It meant this conversation was over. It meant that all the slick marketing talk in the world couldn't erase the way he'd burned bridges he thought he'd never have to cross again. He managed a stiff nod. "Of course," he said quietly. I stood, thanked him again for the meal, and walked out feeling lighter than I had in years. He never called me back, and I never heard from him again. Driving back to the office after that lunch, I couldn't stop thinking about how neatly everything had come full circle. Back when I was 20 and just trying to pay my bills, it had felt like that company, and the man who owned it held all the power. They decided who stayed and who left. They decided whether you got your paycheck on time or whether you had to chase it down. They decided whose loyalty mattered and whose didn't. At the time, I didn't imagine I'd ever have a chance to be the one sitting across the table making the decisions. And I certainly never thought he'd come to me looking for help. I didn't feel triumphant exactly, more like settled, like the universe had given me a quiet opportunity to balance the scales. I didn't need to rub it in. I didn't need to gloat or remind him of every bad decision he'd made. All I had to do was look him in the eye, calmly say no, and let that be the final word. It was a small moment, but it felt bigger than it looked. It reminded me that people who treat others badly often assume there won't be consequences, because they think they'll never need anything from the people they stepped on. But time has a way of circling back. Jobs change, roles reverse, and sometimes, without even trying, you end up exactly where you need to be to remind someone of the bridges they burned. As I pulled into my parking space, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. Not revenge, just closure. And the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, even if he didn't remember me when he walked in that restaurant, he'd never forget me after he walked out.